At 9:40 in the
23,000
morning on
feet
July
over the Third
25,
Reich, death wasn't just a
1944,
possibility,
General
it was a
Lieutenant Fritz
mathematical
Bayerlein
certainty,
stood in a
approaching
field
600
headquarters
miles
2
per
miles
hour.
south of the St. Lo
Second
to
Lieutenant
Perrier's
Robert
Road in
Hughes
Normandy,
struggles
watching
with
the
the yoke
sky
of his
fill with
B-17
American
flying
bombers.
fortress
The summer
as the
air was
formation near
warm.
Schweinfurt.
The morning had dawned
Through the
clear after
transparent
days of
nose
rain and
cone, he spots
overcast
them,
that had delayed the
swarms of
attack
black
everyone
dots
knew was
expanding
coming. French
rapidly.
farmland
These
stretched
are
around him,
Messerschmitt BF-109s
divided by the
and
ancient
Focke-Wulf
hedgerows that had made this campaign a
FW-190s,
grinding
charging
nightmare for both
straight at them,
sides.
closing
Somewhere
the
to the
distance
north,
at nearly Mach
American
0.8
infantry
combined.
waited in their foxholes for
Next
the
to
signal
him,
to
the
advance.
navigator lifts a
Bayerlein was
solitary
45 years
handheld
old.
.50
He
caliber
had commanded the
machine gun.
Panzer Lehr
It is
Division
the
for 6
only
months.
weapon they have
Before
facing
that,
forward.
he had served
It's
as
like bringing
Erwin
a
Rommel's
revolver
chief of
to an
staff in North
artillery
Africa,
duel.
standing
The
beside the
Luftwaffe
Desert
fighters
Fox
start
through the
shooting
victories
from
at
half a
Gazala
mile
and
out.
Tobruk and the
Explosive
defeat at
20
El
millimeter
Alamein.
shells
He had
shred
commanded
the
the
thin
3rd
aluminum
Panzer
skin of the
Division on the
nose.
Eastern Front,
The navigator's
breaking out
weapon
of
goes
Soviet
quiet.
encirclement at
Plexiglass
Kirovograd
explodes.
against Hitler's
Freezing
explicit
air
orders.
howls through the
He had
cockpit.
faced British tanks
Hughes
at El
stares in
Alamein,
disbelief
American
as the lead
infantry
bomber
in
and his
Tunisia,
group simply
Soviet
falls apart.
T-34s
Its
at
front
Kursk.
section
In
sheared
27
off by the
years
frontal
of military
assault.
service,
By the
Fritz
time the
Bayerlein
sun
had
set,
witnessed every form of
60
combat the
fortresses are
20th
gone.
century could
Another
produce.
17
He had
are
survived
scrapped
desert
upon
warfare,
landing. Of the
Arctic cold,
291
artillery
heavy
barrages,
bombers that
and air
departed England,
attacks.
more than a
He carried
quarter
wounds
failed
from
to
multiple
return in one
campaigns.
piece.
He wore the
History
Knight's
would
Cross
brand
with
this
oak
slaughter
leaves and
Black
swords,
Thursday.
one of Germany's
Bomber
highest
Command
decorations
halts
for
all
valor.
deep
But Fritz
penetration missions.
Bayerlein had never
The
seen
strategic
anything
air
like what was
offensive,
coming
the very
toward him
heart
now.
of the Allied
1,500
war
heavy
effort, is on the
bombers,
brink of total
B-17
failure.
flying
What
fortresses,
Hughes doesn't
and
realize as he
B-24
nurses his
Liberators
crippled
stretching
plane
from
back to
horizon
Britain
to horizon.
is that the answer
Behind
already
them,
exists.
another
It is a
1,000
fix
medium
so
bombers and
contentious
fighter
that
bombers,
top brass have
nearly
dismissed it
3,000
as adding
aircraft in
dead weight
total,
to a doomed
carrying over
airframe.
4,000 tons of high
remote-controlled
explosives and
twin-gun
napalm,
turret
all of it
installed
aimed at a
under the
rectangle
nose,
of Norman
created by
countryside,
engineers
6
for a
kilometers long
disastrous
and 2
escort
kilometers
gunship
wide.
experiment.
Bayerlein's
This
division was
addition
sitting
will slap
directly in the center
1,200
of that
pounds onto
rectangle.
an aircraft
What
that
happened
is
over the
already
next
overweight.
96 hours
Test
would
pilots
transform the
scream
most
that it will
elite
kill the
armored
climb rate,
formation in the
ruin
German
agility,
Wehrmacht
and turn
from
the
a feared
bombers into
fighting
easy
force
targets.
into scattered
But General
wreckage.
Henry
It would
Hap
kill
Arnold
or
faces
wound
a
over
dilemma with
70%
no
of
good
the men
options.
under Bayerlein's
Keep
command.
sacrificing
It
bombers
would mark
at
the moment
suicidal
when Germany
rates,
lost
or
control
bet the
of
farm
France
on a
forever,
modification
and it
that
would
might
begin
make
with
its fleet
bombs
even
falling like
slower
rain
and more
from a clear
vulnerable.
summer sky.
The Nazis
Panzer
have
Lehr
found the
Division
flying
should never have
fortress's
existed
fatal
as a
flaw,
combat unit.
and unless the
The word
equation changes,
Lehr means
America's
teaching in
icon
German.
of air
The division had
superiority
been formed
will
in
become
late
its
December
aluminum
1943
coffin. This
from
is the saga
instructors
of
and
the
demonstration
Bendix Chin
troops at
Turret,
Germany's
a
premier
device
tank
born
training
from a
schools.
mistake
These were
fought
not
by the
ordinary
experts and
soldiers.
labeled a death
They were the
wish,
men who taught
a piece
other
of
men how to
engineering
fight
that
in
would
armored
rescue more than
vehicles.
300
They knew
crews
every system
and
on a
alter
Panther
the
tank.
trajectory of the
They
air
could
war in
diagnose
Europe.
engine problems
We
by
are
sound
looking at the
alone.
most critical
They
4
understood
square
tactical
feet of
doctrine
metal
at a
ever
level that
attached
came
to a
only from
United
explaining
States
it to
bomber.
hundreds of students
The
over
Boeing
years of instruction.
B-17 entered
The
the
idea
fray
to
in
create this division
1938
came from
with
a
a bold
desperate
claim.
need.
A
By late
bomber so heavily
1943,
gunned it
Germany
needed
had
no
lost
fighter
catastrophically
protection.
at Stalingrad,
By late
failed at
1943,
Kursk,
that
and was
claim
being
has
pushed
morphed
back
into
across
a
the
death
Eastern
warrant.
Front.
The
Allied
F-model
bombing was
bristles with
devastating German industry.
13.50
The
caliber
anticipated
guns
invasion of
guarding every
Western
vector
Europe would
except the
require
front.
every available
Through
armored
the glazed
formation.
nose,
Adolf
bombardiers
Hitler
and
issued
navigators
Führer
look out
Directive
through
number
sheets of
51
plexiglass,
just before
armed
Christmas
only with portable weapons.
1943,
One
ordering the
flexible
creation
mount,
of new
zero
Panzer
armor,
divisions to meet
zero
the
turret.
expected Allied
For a
assault.
long time,
General
this weak
Oberst
spot
Heinz
remains a
Guderian,
theoretical
the
problem.
architect of German armored
pilots
warfare
attack from the
and
tail and
Inspector
flanks,
General of Armored
right where the
Troops,
fortress
had personally
concentrates its
overseen the
defensive
division's
fire.
creation.
Gunners in
At a
the
meeting
tail,
on January
waist, and ball
26,
turret pump thousands of
1944,
rounds into
at
the
his
bandits.
headquarters,
The strategy
Guderian
works,
told
just
Bayerlein
barely.
that this new
Loss
formation would
rates
be
stay
different
around
from anything the
5% per
Wehrmacht
raid.
had fielded
Commanders
before.
call this
It
acceptable,
would serve as a
though the
model for
airmen know
future
better.
Panzer
With a
divisions,
tour of duty
a
set to
demonstration of what
25
German
missions,
armored
a
forces could
5%
achieve
attrition rate
with the best
means only 1
equipment
in
and the
4
best trained
survives to
men.
go home.
It would be
Then,
lavishly
in November
equipped to levels that
1942,
standard divisions could
Luftwaffe
only
ace
dream
Uber
about,
Lieutenant
and it would be
Egon
commanded
Mayer
by
changes the
Bayerlein
game.
because of his unique
Examining the
experience
wreckage
fighting
of
the
a downed
British and Americans in
B-17
the
in
desert,
France,
where he
Mayer
had learned
studies the nose
firsthand
assembly,
how the Western
thin skin,
Allies made
scant
war.
framing,
The division
and
that
those massive
assembled in the
glass
Nancy
panels.
Verdun area
He
of
runs the
northeastern
geometry
France that
and
winter
uncovers
was
a ruthless
extraordinary
truth.
by any measure.
A head-on
Unlike
pass
standard
exposes the
panzer
German
divisions,
fighter
where
to
most
American
infantry
guns
rode in
for only a
unarmored
split
trucks
second.
vulnerable to every
The
shell
closing
splinter
speed,
and
an
machine gun burst.
FW-190 doing
Every
400
single
miles
panzer
per hour,
grenadier in
meeting a
Panzer Lehr
B-17
travelled
doing
in armoured
200,
half-tracks.
gives
The
American
division
gunners
possessed
less than 3 seconds to
674 of these
spot,
vehicles,
track, and shoot.
more than twice the number
Meanwhile,
in
the
any
German
other
can
formation.
open fire
This
at
meant the
800
infantry
yards
could keep
and
pace
keep
with
the
the
trigger
tanks,
down until
could fight
collision
from their
seems
vehicles,
imminent.
could
On
advance
November
under fire
23,
that would have stopped
1942,
truck-borne troops
Mayer
dead.
takes his
The
squadron
armor was
into the
equally
first
impressive.
organized
The
frontal
division
assault
possessed over
against
200 tanks
B-17s,
and assault
hitting
guns
Saint
on June
Nazaire.
6,
The outcome stuns
1944.
everyone.
This
Mayer
included
personally
97
kills
Panzer
3
IV
bombers
tanks,
on head-on
workhorses
runs,
that had served
watching their
Germany since
noses
the invasion of
disintegrate
Poland.
under
It
20mm
included
cannon
86
fire.
of the new
Other
Panther
pilots
medium
mimic the
tanks,
technique.
45-ton
Within weeks,
monsters with their
Luftwaffe
deadly
chief Otto
75mm
issues new
high-velocity
tactical
guns,
orders to every
capable of
fighter
destroying
wing.
any
The
Allied
frontal
tank
attack,
at
high
ranges
or low,
exceeding
but
1,000
always
meters.
head-on, is the
gun on a
superior
Panther
method.
could penetrate
American
the armor
crews
on a
dub
Sherman
it
tank
12
from over
o'clock
2
high,
kilometers
the
away.
vector of doom
At
coming
normal
straight
combat
down the pipe.
ranges, American
Losses
tankers had
skyrocket.
almost no
The
chance.
Schweinfurt-Regensburg
The division
raid
also
on
received
August
elements
17,
of the 316th Remote
cost
Control
60
Panzer Company,
aircraft,
along
largely
with
to nose
Jagdpanzer
attacks.
IV tank
Survivors
destroyers
bring
in its
back
anti-tank
nightmares.
battalion.
Pilots
The reconnaissance
decapitated
battalion
in their
had a
seats.
company of the brand new
Bombardiers vanished,
SDKFZ
sucked out of shattered
234 Puma
compartments.
armored cars,
Navigators
8
frozen
wheeled
at their
vehicles
desks,
with
gripping
50mm
useless
guns
handheld
that
guns.
could outrun anything
Army
the
Air
Allies
Forces
had
tries
and outfight
everything.
most of
They
their
bolt
light
on
vehicles.
cheap guns,
Even the artillery was
single-point
fully
50s
motorized
sticking out
and
the side
armored,
of the nose.
capable of keeping
Crews
pace with
rig
the
extra
tanks
guns
and
in the
providing
front,
immediate fire
jamming
support.
them into tight
But the
corners
equipment
never
was only
meant for
part of what
weaponry.
made Panzer
Some
Lehr
bombardiers
exceptional.
fly missions
The men
huddled
themselves
behind
were
ammo
veterans
boxes
with
stacked as
experience
makeshift
that could not be
shields.
replicated.
Nothing helps.
60%
The
had
physics are
fought on the Eastern
unforgiving.
Front against
A
the
manual
Soviets,
gun, even
or
with
in
a
North
pro on the
Africa
trigger,
against the
cannot
British and
track
Americans.
a target closing
Many
at
had earned their
600 miles
decorations
per
in the
hour.
desperate fighting
Engineers
at
suggest
Stalingrad,
powered
Kursk,
turrets,
or
but the
Tunisia.
cure
They had
looks worse than
survived
the
the
disease.
destruction of
A
entire
nose
divisions
turret would block
and been
the
selected
bombardier's line of
specifically
sight,
for their ability to
ruining the
teach what
precision
they had
bombing
learned.
role.
Most had
Weight
served
is
as
the
tank
ultimate
instructors
killer.
at the Panzer
Every pound of
Truppenschule,
steel
the
and
Panzer
lead
Troop
means
School,
fewer bombs,
at
less
Wunsdorf,
range,
or
and
other
worse
training
handling.
facilities across
The brass
Germany.
rejects idea
This meant they
after
understood
idea.
armored warfare
The
at a level
B-17F,
few
they
combat
argue,
soldiers
is
ever
already
achieved.
maxed out. By
They could
October
explain the theory behind
1943,
flanking
the
maneuvers.
situation
They
breaks.
knew why certain
Black
terrain
Thursday
favored the attacker
proves
or
the
defender.
Germans have solved
They had spent
the
years
B-17.
breaking down
Bomber
complex
Command
tactical
pauses deep
situations
raids.
into lessons
Without
that green
long-range
recruits could
escorts, which are
understand and
months
apply.
away,
These men
strategic
wore
air
a
bombing
distinctive
faces
uniform.
termination.
Instead of the standard
FDR's
German
pledge
army
to
field
hammer the
blouse,
Nazi war
Panzer
machine
Lehr's
from the
Panzer
sky
Grenadiers
hangs by
wore
a
a short,
thread.
double-breasted
fortress
jacket
needs
similar to
forward
those
teeth,
worn by assault
but
gun
every
crews.
suggested fix
It was a
looks
small
more like
thing,
suicide
but
than
it set them
salvation.
apart.
The answer
They were
comes
not
not
ordinary
from the
soldiers.
Pentagon or
They were
Boeing's
the
designers,
teachers,
but
the
from a
demonstration
failed test
troops, the model
3,000
for
miles
what
away
German
in
armored
Burbank.
infantry should
At
become.
Lockheed's
The average
Vega
age
plant,
in the division was
engineers
just 21 and a
gather around
half
a
years,
freakish plane.
young enough
It's
to
a
be aggressive, to
B-17F,
take
but
risks,
mutated.
to charge
Guns
forward when
stick out
veterans
everywhere.
might hesitate,
A second
but experienced
top turret
enough
sits
to
on the
know when
spine.
aggression became
Most noticeably,
foolishness.
a
It was a
twin-gun
rare
turret hangs
combination,
under the nose,
produced by careful
right where the
selection from
bombardier
training
needs to
units
aim
across
his
the
bomb
Wehrmacht.
sight.
By
This is
June
the
1944,
YB-40 project,
when the division
a bid to
completed
turn
its formation and
B-17s
training,
into destroyer
it numbered
gunships that protect the
14,600,
The idea
34
looks
officers
great
and
on
men.
paper. A
It was the
B-17
strongest
with
armored
no
division
bombs,
in the
packed
German
with
order
ammo
of
and
battle.
guns,
Field
flying
Marshal
wingman
Erwin
to
Rommel
regular
called
bombers.
it the finest Panzer
Vega
division in the
aircraft
West.
gets the job
The great
in September
weakness,
1942.
as some German officers
the
noted
prototype
quietly,
flies by
was
November,
that it
but
concentrated
nobody
the
there
cream of
knows bomber
Germany's
design.
tank commanders and
Vega builds
instructors in a
civilian
single
planes.
unit.
They've never
If
done
Panzer
combat
Lehr was
systems.
destroyed,
The team
Germany would
adapting the
lose
turret,
not just a
a
division,
Bendix
but an
design
entire
meant for other
generation of
uses,
armored
works
warfare
without
expertise.
combat reports,
When
without
Allied
tactical
forces
data,
stormed
and
ashore at
without the
Normandy
deep
on June
knowledge
6,
Boeing has on the airframe.
1944,
Senior
Panzer Lehr
officers
was
view the
positioned near
project with
Chartres,
deep
about
skepticism.
150
In May
kilometers from the
1943,
beaches, as
a
part of
dozen
the strategic armored
YB-40s go
reserve
to
under
England for
Panzer
a
Group
trial by
West.
fire.
The division
It is a
could only be
disaster,
released with Adolf
carrying
Hitler's
14
personal
to 16
authorization.
guns and
This requirement
11,000
existed
rounds.
because
The
Hitler feared the
YB-40
Normandy
is
landing was a
4,500
feint,
pounds
a
heavier than a
diversion to
standard
draw German
B-17.
forces away from the real
Climb speed
invasion
is
site
cut in
at Pas de
half.
Calais.
The gunships
That
can't stay
authorization
in
did not come
formation.
on D-Day.
Once the regular
Hitler
bombers
slept
drop
late
their
that
loads
morning,
and speed up
and
for
his
home,
staff was
the
reluctant to wake
YB-40s
him with
lag
news they
behind,
were not
becoming
certain
easy
about.
prey. By
When
August,
he finally
the program
awoke
is dead.
and learned of the
In
landings,
59
he
missions,
still
the
believed it was a
super-armed
trick.
escorts
The
claim
15th
only
Army,
5
with its
kills.
Panzer
One is
reserves,
shot down.
must remain
The
at Pas de
failure is
Calais
total.
to meet the main
Planners
assault
write
that was
it off
surely
as a
coming.
waste.
Hour
The remaining
after hour
YB-40s
passed,
fly
while
back
German
to the
armour
States for
sat in its
scrap.
assembly areas,
Vega takes
waiting
heat
for
burning
orders that did not
resources on a
come.
bad idea.
By the time the release
files
order
are
finally
locked away.
arrived on June
Another
7th,
dead end in the
precious
quest for
hours had
survival.
been lost.
But in late
The Allies
August
had established
1943,
beachheads.
amidst
They were
the
pushing
finger-pointing,
inland,
A
Every
Douglas
minute of
aircraft
delay
engineer
allowed them
in
to
their
bring more
Tulsa
men
center
and equipment
looks at the
ashore.
YB-40 blueprints.
Bayerlein
He
received
sees
instructions
something
to move his
everyone
division
else
to the
missed.
invasion front
While the
immediately
gunship
and attack
concept
the
failed,
Allied positions.
one part
The
worked
march to
perfectly.
Normandy became a
The
nightmare
Bendix
that
Chin
veterans
Turret.
of Panzer Lehr
Combat
would never
logs
forget.
showed that bombardiers
Allied
using the
aircraft ruled the
remote-controlled
skies.
twin
The
.50s
Luftwaffe,
successfully
stretched thin
engaged
across
head-on
multiple
fighters.
fronts,
The
could provide
turret
almost
offered a
no
steady
cover.
platform,
Typhoon
a
fighter
clear
bombers
view,
from the
and
Royal
most
Air Force
importantly,
and
needed no
P-47
physical muscle to
Thunderbolts from
aim
the
in
United
the
States
windstream.
Army Air
The
Force
operator just
prowled
put the
the roads of
crosshairs on the
France,
bandit.
attacking
The turret
anything that
tracked
moved
smoothly,
during daylight
motors
hours.
eating the recoil.
Bayerlein tried moving
Without
at
a
night,
stamp of approval,
but even this
without
was not
asking
safe.
Boeing or Washington,
The roads were clogged
Douglas
with other
engineers
units
make
also
a call.
trying to reach the front.
Final 86
Villages created
B-17Fs on the
bottlenecks where
line,
vehicles
blocks
bunched up,
70 through
and Allied
75,
night
will
fighters,
get chin
guided by
turrets,
radar
not
and
as
flares,
gunships, not
could
as
still
a test,
find
but
targets
as
in the
standard
darkness.
kit.
Bayerlein
They bet
later
their
reported
careers on a
losing
change
84
everyone else
half-tracks,
turned down.
90 trucks,
The logic
and
holds
5
up.
tanks before his
Installed
division
just the
even
turret,
reached the
not
front
the
lines.
YB-40's
Some
other
vehicles
mess.
burned where they
Add
stopped,
1,200
hit
pounds,
by rockets
not
or machine gun fire
4,500.
from diving
Give the
aircraft.
nose some bite
Others
without
were
killing
abandoned
the plane.
in ditches.
They
Their
don't
fuel
realize
tanks
they have
punctured,
just
their
initiated the
crews
most
killed or scattered
significant
into the
unauthorized
fields.
update
The division
in the
that was
history
supposed to
of
throw the
American
Allies back
aviation.
into the sea lost a
September
significant portion of its
1943.
transport simply
Douglas's
trying to reach the
modification
battle.
lines
The
in
division
Tulsa
reached
run
the
at
front
wartime
lines on
fever.
June 8th
B-17Fs
and was immediately
come
committed
from
to
Boeing's
battle against
hydraulic
British
veins
forces near
snake through
Caen.
tight
There was no
gaps.
time for rest,
Wiring looms
no time for
expand.
reconnaissance,
The Bendix unit
no time
itself,
to develop a
dense
coordinated
pod
attack
holding
plan.
2.5 cows
Allied
with
pressure was
300
too great.
rounds each,
Panzer Lehr
hangs
was
on a
thrown into the
motorized
line
gimbal
to
under
plug
the
a gap
chin.
that threatened to
The
rupture
control
the
setup
entire
is
German
pure
position.
innovation.
For the next
The
7
bombardier
weeks, the
drives
division
the guns
fought
with a
without
small
meaningful
hand
rest
yoke,
or
twisting
reinforcement.
twin grips that
The terrain
signal
was the
servo
Norman
motors.
bocage,
The
a
turret
landscape
moves
unlike
instantly,
anything most of the
sweeping left,
veterans
right,
had
and
experienced.
up, down to follow
Small
the prey.
fields, some
A
no
computing
larger than a
sight
tennis
projects
court,
range
were
data,
surrounded by
but in the
ancient
panic of a
hedgerows that had
head-on
grown for
clash,
centuries.
most men just
These were
point
not
and spray.
ordinary hedges.
The system
They were
is
dense
incredibly
masses of
natural,
vegetation
far
growing
easier
atop
than
earthen
wrestling a
banks
loose
several
gun
feet
in
high,
a 200
their
mile per
roots
hour
intertwined,
gale.
their
But the
branches
update hits
forming
immediate
impenetrable
resistance.
walls.
When
The thick
Major Carl
vegetation made it
Spatz
almost
test flies
impossible
the
for
first
tanks to
modified
maneuver
ship,
off-road.
he logs
A panther
complaints
that tried
instantly.
to crash through a hedgerow
The turret
would rear
adds
up,
1,200
exposing its
pounds
thin
ahead of
belly
the
armor
center
to
of
enemy
gravity,
fire.
making
Most
the
tanks
nose
had
droop.
to use the gaps where
Mechanics
gates had
fix
been
the
cut
trim
through the
with tail
hedgerows.
ballast, but the
But
feel
these
is
gaps
different.
were obvious choke
Takeoff
points where
needs
the
more
enemy would be
stick back
waiting.
pressure.
Every
The
hedgerow
handling
could
is
hide an
sluggish.
anti-tank gun.
Worst of all,
Every
the extra
sunken
mass
lane
hurts
could
the
conceal
ceiling and
infantry
climb.
with bazookas,
Spatz
or
writes
the
a
British
careful
equivalent,
report.
the
The forward
Pi-AT
firepower is
anti-tank
great,
weapon.
but the
A tank
performance
commander
hit is
scanning the
scary.
terrain ahead
At max
might see
weight,
nothing
these
but
planes
peaceful
top out
farmland.
at 25,000
The hidden gun
feet.
that killed him
They reach
would
altitude
fire from
5
less than
minutes
50
later than
meters
stock
away.
planes.
The fighting was
5
intimate
minutes
and
means
brutal.
exposure, danger,
Engagements
gas.
happened at ranges
In
measured
war,
in yards,
minutes are
not
lives.
kilometers. The
News
long-range
hits Boeing
gunnery
Seattle
skills
in
that made
October.
German tankers
The
so
engineers
deadly
there
on
are
the open
furious.
steppes of Russia
Douglas
were
has
almost
hacked
useless
Boeing's
here.
design
What
without
mattered was
asking.
reaction time,
The nose,
the
designed
ability
for
to
clear
spot the
vision,
enemy a
now
fraction
has
of a
a lump
second before he
disrupting
spotted
the
you.
air.
What
Ice
mattered
buildup
was luck.
becomes an issue.
On June 13th,
Crews say the
the
guns,
British
when
7th
fired
Armoured
fully
Division,
up,
the
crack
famous
the
Desert
plexiglass
Rats,
with muzzle
attempted to
blasts.
outflank
Douglas
Panzer Lehr's
rushes out
positions
blast
around
deflectors,
Tilly-sur-Seulles.
but the fixes
The British
feel cheap.
seized the village of
By November
Villers-Bocage and threatened to cut off the entire
86
division.
of these rogue
What followed was one of the
B-17Fs
most
land
famous
in
tank
England.
engagements of
Combat
the war.
units are
SS
confused.
Obersturmführer
There are no
Michael
manuals.
Wittmann,
Crews
commanding a
haven't
Tiger
trained on
tank
them.
from the
Bombardiers
101st
figure
SS
it out
Heavy
by
Panzer
playing with the
Battalion,
controls.
attached to
The
support
planes have
Panzer
no
Lehr,
official model
ambushed
name.
the British
They're
column.
just F
In
models
15
with a
minutes,
weird bump.
Wittmann's Tiger
Mechanics
destroyed
steal
13
parts
to
to keep
14
them
tanks
working,
and
creating
numerous
a
other
supply
vehicles.
chain nightmare.
The British withdrew,
The Army Air Force
but even
has
victories
to choose,
cost Panzer
make
Lehr.
the illegal mod
The
official,
fighting around
or rip the turrets
Tilly-sur-Seulles
off and
ground
tell
on for
Douglas to
weeks.
stop. The
By the
issue
end of
hits
June,
Washington right
the division
as the
had
Black
suffered
Thursday
nearly
casualty
3,000
lists
casualties.
arrive.
It had
Suddenly,
lost 51
the
tanks and
unauthorized
assault
tweak
guns,
looks less like like
82
Mutiny,
half-tracks,
and more like a
and
miracle.
almost 300 other
November
vehicles.
1943,
The elite formation that
Pentagon,
had entered combat
third
3
floor,
weeks earlier
Lieutenant
was already
General
badly
Ira
diminished.
Aker,
On
boss
July
of the 8th
7th,
Air Force,
Bayerline
wires
received
DC
orders to
with a
pull out of
desperate
the British
plea.
sector
The
and
modified
move west
F-models
to face the
with
Americans
Chin
near
turrets, he
St. Lo.
says, are showing
The bocage
promise.
around St. Lo
Bombardiers
was even
feel they
worse
can
than
fight
what they had
back.
left behind.
Squadrons
The
want more of
Americans
them.
were pushing hard,
Aker has one
and
demand:
Panzer was
make
needed
the
to
Chin
plug
turret
holes in the
standard
line.
on all
On July 10th,
B-17s now.
Bayerline launched
The
a
cable
counterattack
lands on
against
General
American
Hap
positions
Arnold's
near the
desk.
village of Le
He faces
Desert.
an internal
It was a
rebellion.
disaster.
Boeing's
American
top engineer,
M10 tank
Claire
destroyers and
Egvet,
fighter bombers
argues
caught the
hard
attacking
against
force
it.
in the the open.
B-17,
30 tanks were destroyed in a single day. The survivors withdrew across the Via Canal with the Americans in pursuit. For the next 2 weeks, Panzerlehr fought a desperate defensive battle.
The mod came from a
Every
failed
day
project,
brought more
the
casualties,
YB-40,
more destroyed
which proved
vehicles,
the idea
more
didn't
ground
work.
lost.
Colonel
On July
Benjamin
19th,
Kelsey,
St.
head of
Lo
fighter
finally
dev,
fell to the
also fights
Americans
it.
after
The
savage
performance
fighting
drag,
that
he
cost
notes,
them
means
5,000
these bombers
men.
will be slower
Bayerlein
and
knew
burn more
what was
gas.
coming next.
In a group,
The Americans would
slowest
try to
plane
break
sets
out.
the pace.
What he did not
Make
know
Chin
was the
Turret
scale
standard,
of what
Kelsey
Lieutenant
says,
General
and the
Omar
whole
Bradley was
fleet gets
planning.
worse.
Bradley had spent
The weight
weeks
is the
developing a
main
plan
argument.
to break the stalemate
A loaded
in Normandy.
B-17F is
By
already near
mid-July,
the breaking
the
point.
Allied position was
Max
becoming
takeoff is
dangerous.
65,000
Over 1 million
pounds.
men had come
The
ashore
turret
since
pushes it to
D-Day,
66,200.
but they remained wedged in a bridgehead
That means
roughly
lower
50 miles
ceilings,
wide and
longer
20 miles deep.
runways, less
Casualties
range.
on both
In
sides
combat,
exceeded
Kelsey
100,000.
insists, these numbers are
The dense
critical.
bocage favored
On
the
December 8,
defenders.
1943,
Every advance cost
Arnold
blood out of
calls a summit
proportion
at
to the
Wright
ground
Field.
gained.
In the
Some
room,
American
Boeing
officers were
reps,
privately
Douglas
comparing the
engineers,
situation to the
Bendix
trenches of
designers,
World
and
War
combat
I.
leaders
The
from
British and
front.
Canadians
It
had
is a
tried
clash of
repeatedly to
theory
break through
versus
around
reality.
Caen.
Boeing
Operation
shows charts.
Epsom, at
Wind
the end of
tunnels
June,
say the turret
had gained
adds
some
3%
ground,
drag.
but failed to achieve
Service
a breakthrough.
ceiling drops
Operation
400
Goodwood
feet.
on July
Climb
18th
rate
had thrown
suffers by
3
40
armoured
feet per
divisions
minute.
against the German
These
lines
margins,
south of
the
Caen.
engineer says,
They
are
lost
the
over
difference
400
between
tanks
safety
in
and
3
getting
days.
bounced by fighters.
The Germans bent
Then,
but did not
Colonel
break.
Curtis
The
LeMay
strategy
stands
Bradley
up.
developed was
Fresh
simple
from
but
leading
audacious.
the 3rd Bomb Division,
Concentrate
LeMay
overwhelming
brings the
force
brutal
at a single
truth.
point,
I've lost
instead of
60
attacking
crews
on a broad
in
front.
90 days, he
Use
says
massive
coldly.
aerial bombardment
38
to
planes
destroy the
to nose
defenders
attacks.
before the ground
I've
assault
watched
began.
Focke-Wulfs
Then
come in
push
head
armoured
on,
columns
while
through
my
the
guys
gap
fired
before the
pea
Germans
shooters.
could react.
The Chin
Speed
Turret
and
changes
violence
the
would
map.
substitute for the
LeMay
grinding
recounts a
attritional
mission
combat
from
that had
October.
characterized the
4
campaign so
modified
far.
planes
The
were in
plan
his
was
group.
codenamed
Fighters
Operation
came in
Cobra.
head on,
It would be the most concentrated application of air power in support of ground forces that the war had yet seen. Major General J. Lawton Collins, commander of the 7th Corps, would lead the main assault. Collins was known as Lightning Joe for his aggressive tactics in the Pacific, where he had commanded the 25th Infantry Division on Guadalcanal and New Georgia. He was 48 years old, young for a Corps commander, but his performance in capturing Cherbourg had demonstrated exactly the kind of relentless drive that Cobra would require. Bradley chose him specifically because Cobra required a commander who would push forward regardless of obstacles, exploiting any opportunity before the Germans could recover. The target zone was a rectangle of bocage straddling the St. Lo to Perrier Road. This was the sector held by Panzerlehr. Bradley did not choose this location by accident. He knew destroying Panzerlehr would remove one of only 2 Panzer divisions facing the American front without armoured reserves. The German line would have nothing to stop a breakthrough. The aerial bombardment would be unlike anything attempted before in support of ground operations. Bradley flew to England personally to request the support of heavy bombers. He wanted bomb craters every 16 feet across the target zone. He wanted the German defenders obliterated. Poor weather delayed the operation repeatedly. Rain and low clouds over Normandy made precision bombing impossible. Bradley needed clear skies so the bombers could see their targets and avoid hitting American troops positioned just north of the target zone. Day after day, meteorologists reported unfavorable conditions. Day after day, the attack was postponed. Finally, on July 24th, conditions seemed favorable enough to launch. 1,600 aircraft took off from bases across England. Heavy bombers climbed to altitude over the English Channel. Fighter bombers armed with rockets and napalm headed for the Normandy coast. The largest coordinated air-ground operation of the war was underway. But as the bombers approached Normandy, clouds rolled in over the target. Visibility dropped. The precise bombing that Bradley needed became impossible. The mission was aborted. Stop orders went out by radio to every aircraft, except not all the aircraft received the recall order. Some bombers had already released their payloads when the cancellation came through. Their bombardiers had identified what they believed were valid targets and toggled their bombs away before the abort signal reached them. Others could not hear the radio calls through atmospheric interference. Still, others had equipment failures that prevented them from receiving communications. Bombs fell on American positions. The 30th Infantry Division, waiting in foxholes just north of the target zone, was hit.
General Spots
25
wrote that
soldiers were
without the
killed.
turret, the bombing
131
campaign
more
would
were
have
wounded.
stopped that
Men
winter.
were buried alive
The
in their fighting
unauthorized mod
positions.
saved
Others
the
were torn
strategy.
apart by blast and
Adolf
fragments.
Gallant agreed.
The attack had not
The
even
Americans
begun,
closed
and
the
Americans
gap.
were already
The nose
dying from
turret
their own
killed our
weapons.
frontal
Bradley was
advantage.
furious.
We never
He
recovered.
had specifically
The
requested that the
engineers who
bombers
did it
approach from the
remain
east,
nameless.
parallel
Douglas
to the
Tulsa
Saint-Lô to
got a
Perriers
plaque,
Road,
but the men who
precisely
acted
to
without
minimize the
permission
risk of
are
bombs
ghosts.
falling on American
They saw
lines.
a need and
Instead,
filled it,
the aircraft
ignoring
had come
the
from the
rules.
north,
Today,
perpendicular to
few
the road.
B-17Gs
Every bomb
remain.
that fell short
In museums,
landed on
people
American
stare
troops.
at the Chin Turret.
What Bradley did
Guides
not fully
explain the
understand
tech,
was
but
that
the
the Air
real
Force
story,
considered
the
a
risk,
parallel
the
approach
fight,
impractical.
the rogue
The time
engineering
required to bring
is often
thousands of
lost.
aircraft around to
Modern
an eastern
bombers
approach
like the
would have stretched
B-52
the
and
bombardment
B-1
over too many
keep
hours.
the legacy
The
alive
perpendicular
with nose
approach
defenses.
allowed a more
The
concentrated
lesson of
attack.
1943
In the minds
is
of the air
doctrine
commanders,
now. No
efficiency
blind
justified
spots.
the additional risk.
For those
But Bradley
3,600
had no
men,
choice.
the turret
The Germans
was
now knew a
everything.
major attack
They
was
went
coming.
home, lived
The element of
lives,
surprise
and
was
grew old,
compromised.
mostly
Either
unaware
Cobra
that their
proceeded the
survival
following day,
hung on a
or it
secret
would have to be
decision in
postponed again,
Oklahoma,
giving
and a
the
general
Germans
who
time to
overruled
reinforce.
the experts. In
Bradley ordered the
1987,
attack to
a
continue
memorial
on
at the
July
Air Force
25th.
Museum appeared.
Fritz Bayerlein
It
spent the
says,
night of July
"Because of you,
24th at his
we came
headquarters
home."
near the village of
It
Cannacy.
honors many, but
He knew
fits
an
the
American
anonymous
attack was
engineers
imminent.
best.
German intelligence
The
had intercepted radio
B-17G
traffic,
teaches us that
indicating a
sometimes
major offensive was
victory
being
relies
prepared,
on someone
but the exact
breaking
timing and
protocol to
location
save
remained
lives.
unclear.
The
At his
modification
disposal,
looked suicidal,
Bayerlein had roughly
adding weight to a
3,200
struggling
combat
plane.
troops in the
In
path of the
reality,
expected
it was
attack.
salvation.
The division
Packaged
had
in
been ground down
1,200
to a
pounds
fraction
of
of its
aluminum,
original strength.
steel, and
He had
inspired
approximately
improvisation.
45